Imagine earning a wage and keeping all of it, every dollar. The government never sees your paycheck because it has no idea what your paycheck is. There is no April deadline. There is no number withheld before the money ever reaches your hands. There is no agency that tracks what you earn, no form you are required to file, no penalty for failing to file it. You work, you are paid, and the money is simply yours. For most people alive today, that sounds like a fantasy, or a promise from a politician who has no intention of keeping it. But it was not a fantasy. For 137 years, from the moment the United States declared its independence in 1776 to a cold February day in 1913, that was not a dream. That was ordinary life. That was simply how America worked. And here is the part that should stop you. During those same 137 years, without ever taking a permanent cut of a single citizen's earnings, the United States did not stagnate. It exploded. It went from 13 bankrupt, war-exhausted colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast to a continental power stretching all the way to the Pacific. It bought Louisiana, it seized the Southwest, it laid railroads, dug canals, built a navy, fought foreign wars, and paid off its national debt down to the last few dollars. All of it financed without an income tax. So the question is not just a curiosity for historians, it is a genuinely unsettling question, because it cuts against something almost every American now assumes is a law of nature. How did the most ambitious young nation on earth pay for itself for well over a century without reaching into your wages? And if it could be done then, if an entire continental empire could be built without the government ever knowing what you earn, then what exactly happened? What broke the streak? What changed? And why did it never change back? The answer is a single war, not the revolution. Not the two world wars that most people would guess. It was a war fought on American soil, between Americans, that quietly and permanently rewired the relationship between the citizen and the state, even though the men who started that rewiring swore, on the record, that it was only temporary. Because here is a truth that runs through this entire story like a thread of iron: there is no tax so permanent as the one a government swears is temporary. Hold on to that sentence. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how it came to define your paycheck. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what the founders built, and why they built it that way. Because the absence of an income tax in early America was not an oversight. It was not that they hadn't gotten around to it yet. It was a deliberate, deeply considered act of architecture. The men who wrote the Constitution had just finished fighting a long and bloody war against a government that taxed them from across an ocean, without their consent and without their voice. Taxation without representation was not a slogan to them. It was the wound, and they were determined that the government they were building would never be able to inflict that same wound on its own people. So when they gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to write the Constitution, they did something subtle and clever. Yes, they gave the new Congress the power to tax. A government that cannot fund itself is not a government, and they had watched the previous arrangement collapse precisely because it could raise no money. But they buried a trap inside that power. They wrote into the Constitution that any direct tax, any tax laid directly on a person or their property, had to be apportioned among the states according to population. That single word, apportioned, was a leash. It meant that if the federal government wanted to raise money by taxing people directly, it could not simply set a rate and collect it. It had to divide the total burden among the states by head count, which produced absurd and unworkable results, charging citizens in a poor state a higher effective rate than citizens in a rich one, purely because of where they lived. The founders knew exactly what they were doing. They were not banning direct taxation outright. They were making it so clumsy, so politically radioactive, and so mathematically ugly that no sane Congress would ever want to use it. They built a door and then welded it shut. And it worked. For decade after decade, the federal government simply did not tax its citizens' incomes because the Constitution made doing so a nightmare. Instead, it funded itself two other ways, and the first of them was so effective that it did almost the entire job on its own. That first method was the tariff, a tax on imported goods. Every time a foreign product landed at an American port, whether it was British cloth, French wine, or Chinese tea, the merchant importing it paid a duty to the federal government at the dock. It was, from the government's point of view, close to perfect. It was easy to collect, because all you needed was a customs officer at a handful of major harbors. It was nearly invisible, because the cost was folded into the price of goods, so the citizen never felt a hand reaching into his pocket. and it was enormous. In the decades before the Civil War, tariffs supplied roughly 90% of all federal revenue, in some years even more. The tariff paid for the Army, it paid for the Navy, it paid down the national debt. It funded nearly the entire operation of the United States government, and it did so without any American ever filling out a form or fearing a knock on the door. The second method was uniquely American, and no European power could copy it, because it depended on something they did not have: land, when the young nation pushed west. The federal government found itself the owner of a staggering ocean of territory, hundreds of millions of acres of public land stretching beyond the Appalachians and eventually to the Rockies and past them. And that land was money. The government surveyed it, divided it into parcels, and sold it to settlers, speculators, and railroad companies. In good years, land sales flooded the treasury with revenue. In one remarkable stretch under President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, land sales and tariffs together did something that has never been repeated in American history before or since. They paid off the entire national debt. The United States government, for one brief and astonishing moment, owed almost nothing to anyone. Try to imagine a modern politician promising that. Now, none of this was clean. The land that filled those federal coffers was, in a very literal sense, taken, cleared through the forced removal of native peoples whose claim to it stretched back thousands of years before the first Europeans set foot on the continent. The money was real, but so was the dispossession behind it. This is part of the honest picture, and any account that leaves it out is selling you a fairy tale. The pre-income tax world was not a lost paradise. It was a smaller, harder, and in many ways crueler country. But it was undeniably a country in which the ordinary working person could live an entire life without ever once interacting with a federal tax collector. The government existed at a distance. It funded itself from the flow of ships and the sale of frontier, not from the labor of its people. The founders had also learned, early and violently, exactly how their fellow citizens would react to the alternative. Because there was one brief early experiment with taxing Americans directly at home, and it nearly tore the young republic apart. In the 1790s, Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and relentless first Treasury Secretary, pushed through a tax on domestically distilled whiskey. On paper, it was reasonable. In practice, it was a catastrophe, because out on the western frontier, whiskey was not a vice. It was the economy. Farmers who could not afford to haul heavy grain over the mountains distilled it into whiskey, which was lighter, more valuable, and in many communities functioned literally as currency. People paid their debts in it. And now a distant government in the capital was demanding a cut of every gallon. The frontier erupted. Tax collectors were beaten, threatened, and in at least one case stripped, tarred, and feathered and left tied to a tree. By 1794, it had become an armed uprising. Thousands of men gathering in western Pennsylvania, some of them talking openly of secession. President Washington himself put on his old uniform and rode west at the head of nearly 13,000 militia to crush it. The rebellion collapsed, but the lesson landed permanently in the political memory of the nation. Americans would tolerate being taxed quietly, at the border, inside the price of goods. They would take up arms before they tolerated the government reaching directly into their homes and their earnings. Thomas Jefferson rode that anti-tax fury straight into the presidency, and one of the first things he did in office was repeal the internal taxes entirely. The message was carved in stone: tax the ships, never tax the citizen. And so the pattern held for generation after generation. In peacetime, tariffs and land paid for everything. The federal government stayed small, not because politicians were unusually virtuous, but because the revenue system itself imposed a ceiling. There was only so much money you could squeeze out of trade and land sales, and that hard limit kept the government lean by force. There was no Social Security, no Medicare, no vast web of federal agencies, because there was simply no money to build them, and no legal way to raise it. The government did the few things it could afford: defend the borders, deliver the mail, run the courts, manage the frontier. That was the deal. And it lasted until the moment the country tried to destroy itself. In April of 1861, the guns opened at Fort Sumter, and the entire comfortable arithmetic of the American government detonated in an instant. The Civil War was coming, and the Union was about to discover that the fiscal system that had served it beautifully for 70 years was catastrophically unequal to the demands of total war. The numbers went insane almost overnight. Before the war, the federal government spent a modest sum running the whole country. Within months of the fighting starting, the War Department alone was burning through $1 million a day, and the figure kept climbing. By the end, the Union would spend billions, a scale of money that had simply never existed in American governance, that dwarfed the entire pre-war budget many times over. And the old revenue engines were failing at exactly the wrong moment. Tariffs depended on trade, and war strangles trade. Southern ports were blockaded, shipping collapsed, and customs revenue fell just as the government's need for cash rose to heights no one had ever imagined. Picture the scene inside the Treasury in that first desperate year. The man responsible for finding the money was Salmon P. Chase, Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, and by the standards of the crisis he was almost comically unprepared. A politician, not a financier, staring at a war whose costs doubled and doubled again while the traditional sources of money dried up in his hands. The banks were suspending payments in gold. The Treasury was nearly empty, and the Union was fighting for its life. Chase did what desperate governments always do when the ordinary rules no longer stretch far enough to cover the emergency. He broke them. He reached for tools the founders had deliberately buried, and he reached for them precisely because it was an emergency, promising, as men in his position always promise, that these were temporary measures for extraordinary times. 3 of those broken rules would change America forever. The first was paper money. In 1862, the government began printing a new national currency, the greenbacks, paper notes backed not by gold in a vault, but by nothing more than the promise and the taxing power of the United States government itself. Roughly $450 million of this new money was created, more or less out of thin air, to pay soldiers and suppliers when there was no gold to pay them with. This is worth pausing on, because one of the oldest and quietest ways a government funds itself is simply by creating money, by spending currency it conjures into existence, capturing the value of that new money before prices catch up. It is a hidden tax paid by everyone who holds dollars, and most people never even notice it happening. The Civil War made it a tool of national survival, and once a government learns that trick, it does not forget it. The second broken rule was mass borrowing on a scale never before attempted. The government sold war bonds, hundreds of millions of dollars of them. And to sell them it turned to a financier named J. Cook, who did something genuinely new. He did not just sell bonds to a handful of wealthy banks. He sold the war to the ordinary public. He built a nationwide sales machine, blanketed newspapers with advertisements, and recruited armies of agents to sell bonds in small denominations to school teachers, shopkeepers, and farmers, wrapping the whole thing in patriotism. For the first time, the common citizen was not just a taxpayer, but a financier of the war, personally invested in the government's survival. It was mass finance meeting mass persuasion, and it foreshadowed a century of governments learning to sell their citizens on funding the very machinery that would one day tax them. And the third broken rule, the one that matters most for our story, was the income tax. For the first time in the history of the United States, in the Revenue Act of 1861, and then far more seriously in the Revenue Act of 1862, the federal government imposed a tax directly on the incomes of its citizens. It started modestly, and it started progressive, a few percent on middle incomes, a higher rate on the largest ones. It was aimed mostly at the wealthy, and only a small fraction of the population earned enough to owe anything at all. But the principle was the thing. For the first time, the government was asserting a direct claim on what an American earned. The door the founders had welded shut had been torn off its hinges by the pressure of war. And to collect this new tax, Congress created something that had never existed before, a permanent agency inside the Treasury whose entire purpose was to assess and collect taxes on the American people. It began almost pathetically small. The first Commissioner of Internal Revenue started with a staff you could count on your fingers. Within a matter of months, that handful of clerks had swollen into an army of nearly 4,000 assessors and collectors spread across the country. Many of them paid on commission, meaning the more they collected, the more they personally earned. This was the seed. This was the beginning of the agency that would grow decade after decade into the Internal Revenue Service, the single most feared arm of the federal government, the one institution that knows more about your private life than any other. It was born in a war, as an emergency measure to fund an emergency, and it never went away. Now, the men who built all of this were not lying exactly when they called it temporary. They genuinely meant it. The income tax of the Civil War was understood by nearly everyone as a wartime necessity, justified only by the extraordinary fact of national survival, to be discarded the moment the crisis passed. And true to that promise, after the war ended, the pressure to kill the tax built steadily, and in 1872, 7 years after Appomattox, Congress did exactly what it had promised. It repealed the income tax. The wartime experiment was over. The tax was gone. Americans went back to being funded by tariffs and by taxes on liquor and tobacco, and the vast majority of citizens once again lived free of any federal claim on their earnings. The door, it seemed, had been shut again. But something had changed, and it had changed forever, even if almost no one could see it yet. The taboo was broken. The machinery had been built. The legal precedent existed. An entire generation of politicians now knew, as a proven fact, that the government could reach directly into the incomes of its citizens, that it could build an agency to do so, and that the republic would not collapse when it did. You cannot unknow a thing like that. The income tax was gone from the law books, but it was now permanently alive in the realm of the possible. And the possible has a way of becoming the inevitable when enough people decide they want it. Here is where the story takes a turn that most people have never heard, and it involves the Supreme Court contradicting itself in the span of 14 years. Because the constitutional question, was an income tax even legal under that apportionment trap the founders had built, had never been fully settled. And in 1881, in a case called Springer versus the United States, the Supreme Court looked directly at the Civil War income tax and ruled that it was perfectly constitutional. The court held that an income tax was not the kind of direct tax that had to be apportioned, and so the founders' welded door did not block it after all. For a moment, the path to a permanent income tax lay wide open, blessed by the highest court in the land. And then the country changed underneath the question. The late 1800s became the age of the robber barons, of Rockefeller, of Carnegie, of Morgan, an era of staggering industrial fortunes rising alongside equally staggering poverty. And the old tariff system, once celebrated as painless, began to look like exactly what it was, a deeply unfair arrangement. Because a tariff is a tax on consumption, and it falls hardest on the people who spend the largest share of their income just to live. A struggling farmer buying a plow paid the same tariff markup as a wealthy banker buying the same plow. But for the farmer, that markup swallowed a real piece of his survival, while for the banker it was nothing. Worse, the industrialists had learned to weaponize the tariff, lobbying for ever higher rates to shield their own factories from competition, using the government's revenue system to pad their fortunes at the expense of ordinary consumers. A system built to fund the government had quietly become a machine for transferring wealth upward, from the many to the few. And out of that anger, a powerful new idea took hold across the farms and factory towns of the country. Instead of taxing the goods that everyone had to buy, why not tax the incomes of the people who had grown obscenely rich? In 1894, riding that wave of populist fury, Congress passed a modest peacetime income tax, a small levy aimed squarely at the wealthiest Americans. And it lasted barely a year. Because in 1895, in a case called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, the very same Supreme Court that had blessed the income tax in 1881 turned around and struck it down, 5 votes to 4. The court now decided that a tax on income from property was in fact a direct tax, that it did have to be apportioned, and that since this one wasn't, the whole thing was unconstitutional. In 14 years, the highest court in the land had completely reversed itself. One of the dissenting justices wrote, in open fury, that the ruling amounted to a surrender of the taxing power to the wealthy, a legal shield erected by the moneyed class to protect itself from ever having to contribute its fair share. And to millions of ordinary Americans, that is exactly what it looked like. The rich had bought themselves a constitution. That single decision poured gasoline on the fire, and it did something the wealthy backers of the ruling never anticipated. It turned the income tax from a policy proposal into a crusade. If the Supreme Court said the Constitution forbade taxing the rich, then, the reformers concluded, the Constitution itself would have to change. And that is a far heavier lift, because amending the Constitution requires overwhelming supermajorities, 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and ratification by 3/4 of all the states. It is designed to be nearly impossible. But the political pressure kept building, year after year, fueled by a rising progressive movement convinced that the entire system had been captured by corporate money. The breakthrough came, strangely, from a man who did not particularly want it. In 1909, President William Howard Taft, a cautious conservative Republican and no populist firebrand, proposed a constitutional amendment to explicitly give Congress the power to tax incomes from any source without any apportionment at all. It was a direct surgical strike at the Pollock decision, designed to demolish the constitutional obstacle once and for all. And then it went out to the states for ratification, a process that dragged on for nearly 4 years, as wealthy industrialists and their allies fought it at every turn. warning, accurately, as it turned out, that an income tax would make the federal government vastly more powerful than the founders had ever intended. But the political tide was against them. State after state ratified. And on February the 3rd, 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States became law. The welded door that the founders had built to protect the citizen from direct taxation was not just torn open this time. It was removed from the Constitution itself, permanently by the Constitution itself. Later that same year, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1913, and the modern income tax was born. And here is the detail that the audience for this history always finds the most maddening. And the most instructive. It was tiny. 1% on incomes above $3,000, with a top surtax reaching only 7%, and only on the enormous incomes above $500,000. In its first year, it applied to only around 3% of American households. The overwhelming majority of Americans owed nothing at all. If you had stood in 1913 and warned people that this modest, gentle little tax on the very rich would one day take a bite out of nearly every working person's paycheck before they had even seen the money, you would have been laughed out of the room. It was temporary in spirit, modest in scope, and aimed only at the wealthy. Remember the sentence from the beginning. There is no tax so permanent as the one a government swears is temporary, and there is no tax so universal as the one that begins by promising to touch only the rich. Because what happened next is the whole point. The structure was now in place, the constitutional power, the collecting agency, the legal machinery, all of it inherited directly from that Civil War experiment that everyone had sworn was temporary. All it needed was a reason to grow. And reasons, it turns out, are never in short supply. The very next year, in 1914, the First World War erupted in Europe. And once again, a war became the engine that expanded the tax. The top income tax rate, 7% in 1913, was driven upward with breathtaking speed to 15%, then to 67%, and by 1918 to a staggering 77%. The number of Americans required to pay ballooned, and when the war ended and the rates came down, they never came down to where they had started. They never do. Each crisis ratcheted the tax upward, and each piece left it higher than before. This is the mechanism. This is how a temporary tax on the rich becomes a permanent tax on everyone, not in one dramatic act, but through a series of emergencies, each one justified, each one leaving the machine a little larger than it found it. And then came the change that finally reached into the pocket of the ordinary working American, the one that touches you, right now, in every paycheck you receive. It happened during the Second World War, in 1943, and it was arguably the single most consequential fiscal innovation in American history, precisely because almost no one noticed how consequential it was. It was called withholding. Before 1943, if you owed income tax, you paid it yourself in a lump sum once a year. You had to physically write a check to the government and hand over your own money, and that act, that painful, conscious act of surrendering a stack of your own earnings was a powerful brake on how high taxes could go, because people could feel exactly what they were paying. Withholding erased that. Under the new system, your employer simply removed the tax from your wages before you ever saw them, before the money ever touched your hands. The government got its cut first, silently, automatically, invisibly. You never had to write the check, because you never had the money to begin with. The pain vanished. And when the pain vanishes, so does the limit. Withholding is the reason a tax that touched 3% of households in 1913 could grow to touch nearly every working American, and why most people today have no real sense of how much they actually pay, because they never hold it long enough to miss it. It was, from the government's perspective, a masterpiece. From yours. It is the reason your paycheck says one number at the top and a smaller number at the bottom, and you have simply learned to live in the gap. So step back and look at the full arc of what happened, because it is genuinely one of the great transformations in the life of the nation, and it is almost invisible precisely because it happened so slowly. For 137 years, the federal government funded itself without a permanent claim on your income, held there by a constitutional leash the founders had deliberately built, and by a hard revenue ceiling that kept it small. Then, one war, the Civil War, shattered the taboo, built the machinery, and proved the thing could be done. The promise that it was temporary was sincere, and it was kept for a while. But the knowledge could not be unlearned, and the constitutional door, once torn open, was finally removed altogether in 1913. And from that moment, freed at last from its ancient ceiling, the government could raise money with no natural limit at all. And with unlimited revenue came unlimited ambition. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, vast departments and agencies that would have been unimaginable to Hamilton or Jefferson, not because they lacked the will to build them, but because they lacked, and knew they lacked, the money. Look at where it landed. Today, the federal government collects trillions of dollars a year, and the overwhelming majority of that, well over 90%, comes from taxing the incomes and wages of ordinary Americans through the income tax and the payroll taxes that fund Social Security and Medicare. And the tariff, the mighty engine that once funded the entire government all by itself, it now brings in a rounding error, barely more than 1% of the total. The whole system has been turned precisely upside down. The founders built a government funded by trade and shielded the citizen. We built a government funded by the citizen and shielded trade. And whether that inversion represents progress or a betrayal of the original design is, in the end, not a question of history. It is a question of values, and it is one you will have to answer for yourself. Because here is the thing that makes this story matter, right now in your life, and not just in a history book. That old argument never actually ended. The tension between funding a government through tariffs on goods and funding it through taxes on income, the exact fight that ran from Hamilton to the Whiskey Rebellion to the robber barons to 1913, is not a settled chapter of the past. It is a live and roaring debate in American politics today, as tariffs return to the center of the national conversation and voices once again ask whether the country could fund itself the way it did for its first century. Every time you hear that argument, understand that you are not hearing something new. You are hearing the oldest financial debate in American history, the same one the founders had, wearing modern clothes. The players have changed. The stakes have changed. The question has not changed at all. Who should pay for the government, the buyer at the border, or the worker at the paycheck? The many who consume, or the few who earn the most? Hidden taxes that no one feels, or visible taxes that everyone resents? And that is really what this entire story has been about. Not tariffs, not amendments, not the dry mechanics of revenue. It has been about power. Because the question of how a government funds itself is never really a question about money. It is a question about control. It is a question of who pays, who benefits, and who decides. For 137 years, the answer to that question kept the American government at arm's length from the American citizen. One war changed the answer. And once it changed for good. Because the deepest lesson buried in all of this is the one we started with, the one you should carry out of this video and into the next time a leader promises you that some new burden is only temporary. There is no tax so permanent as the one a government swears is temporary. The men who built the income tax believed every word of that promise, and more than a century later, you are still paying it. If this shifted the way you see the money taken out of your own paycheck, take a second to subscribe, because we go deep on exactly these kinds of hidden machineries of power, the ones that shape your life while staying just out of sight. And if this story left you with one nagging question, it should be this one. 1913 did not just give America the permanent income tax. In that very same year, the country was handed something else. Something that would come to control the value of every dollar you have ever earned. That is a story of its own, and it is the one we are telling next. You will not want to miss it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.